Lesson 23 picks up on Lesson 21, giving you the irregular version of the aorist indicatives. Again, we might want to think about patterns of irregularity. You've met Luor. You've seen that imperfects and aorists augment, that aorists then gain a suffix, and that you then add a pattern of endings. The irregular ones are going to work on the basic idea of changing their stem, and this time using imperfect endings. You still augment, and for verbs that started with an epsilon and alpha, your augmentation is already built in. You then move balo, ebalon with 2 lambdas, ebalon with 1 lambda. Herisco, heriskon, heuron, shortened stem. Iro, aeron, and now this was a liquid verb. And remember, the liquid verbs weren't really being irregular so much as just getting rid of the sigma. So you are actually putting the alpha back in again. Now notice that you haven't got an iota subscript. You've kept that shortened stem that you had with the ar in the aorist participle. And you've got your aorist alpha on the end, but no sigma. So you're now going to use imperfect endings for any of the ones that change their stem, and your normal aorist endings on any of the ones that are liquid and have just changed their stem in that way, by getting rid of the sigma rather than by changing their stem full stop. That's as much as Dobson introduces in Lesson 23. I now want to have a look at some of the vocab he's given you in the light of some of these things. He gives you eidon in Lesson 22. This means I saw. It's the aorist of horao. And it has a participle idon. In this case, the participle has no augment, whereas you saw with apon, I spoke, gives you the participle apon, having spoken. So eidon and apon look very similar in terms of form, but actually apon never loses the epsilon and eidon does. Horse, as, like, so. There are lots of different things horse can mean. I will add a separate document explaining some of those. Cathals you've had lots of times in this book, just as, or possibly like, or something like that. Peri, it depends slightly what case you're using. Peri plus the accusative means around. Peri plus the genitive means concerning. Anabino and catabino. That bino, as I said before, only takes compounds. So this is I go up. Catabino, I go down. And that gives you Anabasis, which is the name of a book by Xenophon, all about his march and warfare, and Catabino, which gives you Catabasis, which is one of the terms used for the descent to the underworld. There's also the adjective pas, meaning all or every, genitive pantos in the masculine. Have a look back at the aorist participles in chapter 20, because this is a 3-1-3 adjective, like lusas. So it's going to decline variously depending on the gender. Looking at the chapter 23 vocab, hamartno, I sin. It comes from the idea of missing the mark with bow and arrow, but it ends up meaning sin and moves between the literal to the metaphorical throughout the history of Greek. It's got an irregular aorist, hemarton. You saw in lambano that the an is one of the things that gets lost in a stem. You get that in hemartono. Iro, take or raise. Take up, raise. Holithos, stone. Think about lithography or monolith. Stauros, cross. Gives us the Greek name Stavros. Polis, city. Politics. Any of those kind of things. It's a third declension, so you need to learn the genitive poleos. It's one of the very idiosyncratic ones that's on your list as a separate one to learn. Thalassa, C. Now, this is something where in Attic dialect, the double sigma will become a double tau. You see that double sigma to double tau in places like Hebrews. You will see it if you read it outside of the New Testament in very Attic texts. Pneuma, spirit. Third declension, so the genitive is pneumatos. Akathartos, unclean. That on the front is what we call the alpha privative. Way of negating something in Greek is you can put an alpha on the front of it. It's the equivalent of un in English. Erortao, I ask. You can also see it as ep erortao as a compound, and between the two they're quite common, although individually they're not always looking so common. So that's your overview of the irregular aorists. It is just worth stopping to think about terminology. I've called them irregular because that's probably the least loaded. You'll also see various other things being used. You'll see irregular called strong, while regular are called weak. You'll see irregular called second, while regular are called first. So you've got at least 3 different ways of referring to these. I am most likely to call them strong aorists, although I won't call normal ones weak. That language has gone out of fashion because there's nothing strong about the word. It's just how I learned them, so I'm much more likely to call them strong aorists. But they are irregular verbs. And if you're looking up in a grammar book, you may well find them discussed under irregular verbs.